There's a spiritual secret so powerful that traditional churches rarely teach it, not because it's wrong, but because it completely shifts where you look for God. Joel Goldsmith discovered this truth that transforms everything. You don't need to ask God for anything because consciousness itself is the creative power. Most religious teaching keeps you in a state of spiritual begging, praying for God to change your circumstances, heal your body, or improve your finances. This approach assumes God is separate from you deciding whether to grant your requests. But Goldsmith revealed something that challenges this entire framework. The secret isn't about praying harder or having more faith in an external deity. It's about recognizing that divine consciousness is already your true identity. When you realize this, you stop asking and start recognizing what already exists in spiritual reality. This recognition practice dissolves the separation between you and the divine. It's why Goldsmith students experienced healings, abundance, and peace without traditional petitionary prayer. You're about to discover why this changes everything. Traditional Christianity teaches you to pray for things: health, money, relationships, protection. Goldsmith's mystical approach reveals why this keeps you trapped in limitation. Every time you ask God for something, you're affirming that you lack it, that God hasn't already provided it in consciousness. Recognition prayer operates from a completely different foundation. Instead of asking God to heal your body, you recognize that in spiritual consciousness, wholeness already exists. You're not trying to change reality, but to see through the illusion of material limitation. This isn't positive thinking or mental affirmation. It's a shift in identity from personal human to spiritual consciousness. When Robert, a businessman facing bankruptcy, learned this approach, he stopped asking God to fix his finances. Instead, he practiced recognizing divine abundance as the only reality. Within 3 months, unexpected opportunities emerged, old debts were forgiven, and his business stabilized. Not because God finally answered his prayers, but because his consciousness shifted from lack to recognition of what already existed spiritually. Here's why your pastor doesn't teach this. It threatens the entire structure of religious dependency. If you can recognize spiritual truth directly without an intermediary, without needing someone to pray for you or intercede with God, what happens to institutional religious power? Goldsmith wasn't trying to destroy Christianity. He was revealing its mystical core that got buried under centuries of organizational religion. The early Christian mystics knew this secret. They experienced direct communion with divine consciousness without elaborate rituals or hierarchical structures. When you practice recognition instead of petition, you're claiming your spiritual authority. You're acknowledging that the kingdom of God is within you, not in a distant heaven requiring someone else's permission to access. This shift terrifies religious systems built on your sense of separation from the divine. Most churches need you to believe you're a sinner, separated from God, constantly needing forgiveness, guidance, and intervention. Goldsmith's teaching reveals you are spiritual consciousness itself, temporarily appearing in human form, but never truly separated from the divine source. The recognition technique is beautifully simple, yet profoundly powerful. Instead of asking for what you need, you pause and recognize spiritual truth. When faced with illness, you don't beg God for healing. You recognize that in consciousness there is no disease, only divine wholeness. When financial pressure mounts, you don't petition for money. You recognize that infinite abundance is the nature of consciousness itself, unaffected by material appearances of lack. When relationships feel broken, you recognize the perfect spiritual nature of all beings beyond human personality conflicts. This practice takes time to develop. You won't master it overnight. Your mind has decades of conditioning and petitionary prayer, believing you must convince God to help you. Recognition requires patient practice, gently redirecting your thoughts from asking to acknowledging. Start with small moments throughout your day. Clears throat when worry arises. Pause and recognize peace as your true spiritual nature. When lack appears, recognize abundance as consciousness itself. This gradual shift from petition to recognition transforms your entire spiritual experience, over weeks and months of consistent practice. Amanda worked as a hospital nurse, surrounded by illness and suffering daily. She'd been a faithful churchgoer for 30 years, praying constantly for her patients, asking God to heal them. Despite her devotion, she felt increasingly powerless, watching people deteriorate despite fervent prayers. When she discovered Goldsmith's recognition approach, everything shifted. Instead of begging God to heal her patients, she began practicing recognition of their spiritual perfection. She would silently acknowledge that consciousness knows no disease, that spiritual identity remains untouched by material appearances. The change didn't happen instantly. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed different externally, but Amanda noticed her own anxiety decreasing. She felt more peaceful in the midst of medical chaos. Her patients began commenting on the calming energy she brought into their rooms. After 2 months of consistent practice, she witnessed what doctors called spontaneous remissions in 3 separate patients who'd been given terminal diagnosis. Was it her recognition practice? She couldn't prove causation, but she knew something fundamental had shifted in how she approached healing beyond medical intervention. Daniel had been a pastor for 15 years before encountering Goldsmith's teachings. He taught his congregation to pray for needs, to ask God for intervention, to have faith that prayers would be answered. But privately, he struggled with the inconsistency of answered versus unanswered prayers. When he began studying mystical Christianity, everything he'd taught suddenly seemed incomplete. He realized he'd been perpetuating spiritual dependency rather than spiritual empowerment. His congregation looked to him to intercede with God on their behalf instead of recognizing their own divine nature. Daniel faced a profound choice: continue teaching traditional petitionary prayer or risk his position by introducing recognition practice. He started, gradually weaving in concepts of divine consciousness as present reality rather than distant deity. Some congregants resonated immediately. Others felt uncomfortable with the shift. Within 6 months, he'd lost about 30% of his congregation, but the remaining members experienced breakthrough healings, financial transformations, and relationship restorations. They'd stopped waiting for God to act and started recognizing spiritual truth. Daniel had traded religious popularity for authentic spiritual power. Nicole struggled with chronic migraines for 12 years. She'd tried every medical treatment, every prayer ministry, every healing service. Pastors laid hands on her. Prayer warriors interceded. Yet the migraines persisted. She felt abandoned by God, questioning why her desperate prayers went unanswered. Goldsmith's approach gave her a completely different framework. She realized her prayers had been affirming the reality of her condition, making it more solid in her consciousness. Every time she begged God to remove the migraines, she reinforced their existence in her awareness. She began practicing recognition differently. Instead of acknowledging the pain and asking for relief, she would pause during migraine onset and recognize consciousness as the only reality. She would silently affirm that spiritual truth knows no pain, no material limitation, no physical disturbance. Progress came gradually over 3 months. Migraines decreased in intensity first, then in frequency. She learned to catch them earlier with recognition practice before they fully developed. After 8 months, she'd gone 3 weeks completely pain-free, something that hadn't happened in over a decade of medical treatment and traditional prayer. The pattern across these stories reveals something crucial. Recognition practice works gradually through consistent application, not through dramatic instant miracles. This is why churches prefer the instant healing narrative. It's more emotionally compelling, even though it rarely produces lasting results for most people. Goldsmith's mystical approach requires patient dedication. You're retraining consciousness itself, undoing decades of material-focused thinking. You're learning to see through appearances to spiritual reality. This transformation happens progressively as you practice daily recognition of truth beyond material evidence. Some people experience rapid shifts. Others need months of consistent practice. The key is persistence without measuring results. The moment you check whether recognition is working, you've shifted back to material consciousness, evaluating appearances rather than resting in spiritual truth. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore recognition practice. Like this video to help others discover Goldsmith's mystical teachings. Subscribe for more consciousness, shifting wisdom, and comment which healing journey resonated most deeply with your own spiritual path. Beyond basic recognition, Goldsmith taught the practice of impersonalization. This technique addresses one of the biggest obstacles in spiritual healing, taking appearances personally. When illness strikes, you think it's your disease. When lack appears, you believe it's your poverty. This personalization gives power to material appearances. Impersonalization means recognizing that what appears as your problem isn't personal at all. Disease is just universal material belief appearing as a condition in your experience. Financial lack is just world consciousness of limitations showing up in your awareness. Relationship conflict is just human personality patterns manifesting temporarily. When you impersonalize, you stop fighting your specific problem and recognize the impersonal nature of all material appearances. Brian discovered this when business competition threatened his company. Instead of seeing it as a personal attack, he recognized it as impersonal business beliefs playing out in material consciousness. He practiced seeing his competitors not as enemies but as spiritual beings, temporarily expressing competitive human patterns. Within weeks, the hostile energy dissolved. Two competitors approached him about collaboration rather than combat. Impersonalization shifted high. Consciousness from battle to recognition of shared spiritual identity beyond business personalities. Another powerful complement to recognition is nothingization. This technique directly challenges the reality we give to problems. In material consciousness, we make problems very real and solid. We discuss them, analyze them, fight against them. All of this gives them power in our awareness. Nothing means recognizing that from the standpoint of spiritual consciousness, the problem has no reality, no power, no substance. It's not that you pretend the appearance doesn't exist. You acknowledge the appearance while recognizing it has no spiritual substance supporting it. Emily practiced this with severe chronic anxiety that had controlled her life for 8 years. Medical treatment helped somewhat, but panic attacks still disrupted her work and relationships daily. Instead of making the anxiety real and solid through fear and constant monitoring, she practiced nothing it while continuing her medical care. She recognized that in divine consciousness there is no anxiety, no fear, no mental condition with power over spiritual truth. After 6 weeks of consistent practice alongside her treatment, panic attacks decreased significantly. After 3 months, she experienced her first anxiety-free week in nearly a decade. Her consciousness shift supported her healing process completely. The practice of spiritual listening rounds out Goldsmith's core techniques. Most prayer involves talking to God, asking, petitioning, explaining your needs. Spiritual listening reverses this entirely. You become silent, receptive, open to divine wisdom flowing into your awareness without human direction. This isn't meditation with mantras or focused concentration. It's a gentle resting and receptive awareness, allowing spiritual truth to reveal itself without your mental interference. You're not trying to hear specific guidance about your problems. You're simply being present to consciousness itself. Kevin practiced spiritual listening each morning before work. He would sit quietly for 15 minutes, not asking for anything, not focusing on problems, just being receptive to whatever truth wanted to emerge. For the first week, his mind chattered endlessly with to-do lists and worries. Gradually, moments of deep peace began arising. Sometimes a simple truth would surface. All is well. You are cared for. Divine love surrounds you. These weren't dramatic revelations, but quiet assurances that shifted his entire approach to daily challenges. After a month of consistent listening, he navigated work crisis with unexpected calm and clarity. Combining these techniques creates powerful synergy. You might start with recognition of spiritual truth, then practice impersonalization to remove the personal sting from appearances. Follow with nothingization to withdraw reality from the problem, and finish with spiritual listening to receive divine wisdom directly. The key is not treating these as mechanical steps or formulas. They're different doorways into the same consciousness shift from material awareness to spiritual recognition. Some situations respond better to one approach, others to different combinations. You learn through practice which technique serves each circumstance. Stephanie developed her own rhythm with these practices over 6 months. Morning situations often called for spiritual listening first, establishing her consciousness in divine awareness before daily activities. Midday challenges responded well to quick impersonalization, removing the personal edge from stressful interactions. Evening worries dissolved through recognition and nothingization combined. She'd recognize spiritual truth while simultaneously withdrawing power from material appearances. This integrated approach transformed her life gradually but profoundly. The techniques became natural responses rather than forced spiritual exercises requiring effort. Let's address the biggest challenge with Goldsmith's approach. Nothing seems to be happening. You practice recognition daily. You impersonalize problems. You nothing appearances. Yet circumstances don't immediately change. This is where most people abandon these practices and return to petitionary prayer or give up entirely. Goldsmith was clear about this obstacle. Consciousness transformation precedes circumstantial change. You're not manipulating external conditions through these practices. You're shifting your own awareness from material to spiritual consciousness. External appearances often lag behind this internal shift, sometimes by weeks or months. The temptation is to measure success by immediate material results. Did the illness disappear? Did the money arrive? Did the relationship improve? This evaluation itself is material consciousness checking on spiritual practice, which short-circuits the entire process. You must practice recognition without measuring outcomes. William faced this challenge with mounting business debt. He practiced recognition of divine abundance for 3 weeks with no visible change. Bills continued arriving. Creditors still called. Bank balance stayed negative. His mind screamed that this wasn't working, that he needed to return to desperate prayer, asking God to rescue him. The breakthrough for William came when he stopped checking results and simply rested in recognition regardless of appearances. He realized that measuring outcomes meant he was still giving power to material circumstances. He committed to 90 days of pure recognition practice without evaluating external evidence. During weeks 4 through 7, things actually seemed to worsen. More bills, more pressure, more financial stress. But William maintained his practice, recognizing divine abundance as the only reality despite contrary appearances. He wasn't denying the bills existed. He was refusing to accept them as spiritual truth. Around week 8, subtle shifts began. A client paid an old invoice unexpectedly. A creditor offered extended payment terms without William requesting it. Small but encouraging signs that consciousness was shifting beneath surface appearances. He continued practicing without attaching to these improvements. By week 12, his financial situation had transformed completely. New contracts materialized. Old debts were forgiven. Unexpected income sources emerged. The external change reflected his internal consciousness shift that had been occurring all along, invisible until it reached critical mass and manifested in material circumstances. Another major challenge is the pull of collective consciousness. You're practicing recognition of spiritual truth while surrounded by people affirming material limitation. Family members worry about your health. Friends discuss economic problems. News media constantly broadcasts fear and scarcity. This collective agreement on material reality exerts tremendous pressure. Goldsmith taught the importance of protecting your consciousness from mass hypnosis. This doesn't mean isolating yourself from the world. It means recognizing that collective beliefs are still just beliefs, not truth. When everyone agrees that economic recession is real, you practice recognizing divine abundance regardless of mass agreement. Laura experienced this challenge during a health crisis. Her diagnosis was serious and everyone in her life reinforced the medical prognosis with concern and worry. Their love was genuine, but their fear was contagious. Each conversation about her condition pulled her back into material consciousness of disease. She learned to silently practice recognition during these interactions. While family members discussed her illness, she internally recognized her spiritual wholeness. She didn't argue with them or try to convince them. She simply maintained her own consciousness in spiritual truth. while allowing them their human concern without absorbing it. The final major challenge is the temptation to mix approaches. You practice recognition for a while, then switch to traditional prayer when pressure intensifies. You impersonalize problems sometimes, but take them personally when they feel overwhelming. This inconsistency prevents consciousness from stabilizing in spiritual truth. Goldsmith emphasized the importance of choosing your foundation. If you're going to practice recognition, commit to it fully, even when material appearances scream otherwise. If you keep reverting to petitionary prayer during crisis, you're affirming that recognition isn't sufficient, which undermines the entire practice. This doesn't mean you can never adjust your approach, but the adjustment should come from expanded spiritual understanding, not from fear that recognition isn't working. The consciousness that panics and abandons recognition during difficulty is exactly the consciousness that needs transformation through continued practice. If these challenge-breaking insights speak to your spiritual journey, like to support this transformative content, subscribe for advanced Goldsmith practices that deepen consciousness, and comment which obstacle are you ready to overcome through recognition today. Advanced integration of Goldsmith's teachings means practicing recognition in the midst of daily activities, not just during quiet meditation. Matthew worked in high-pressure emergency services where split-second decisions affected life and death. He couldn't stop for formal spiritual practice during crisis. He learned practice micro-recognitions throughout his workday. In the seconds between receiving an emergency call and arriving on scene, he'd recognize divine order governing all life. While treating injuries, he'd silently acknowledge the spiritual wholeness beneath material appearances. These brief recognitions anchored his consciousness in spiritual truth. The results were remarkable. His colleagues noticed his unusual calm during chaotic situations. Patients responded better to his care compared to other emergency responders with identical medical training. He made fewer mistakes under pressure because he wasn't operating from fear-based material consciousness, but from recognition of spiritual governance. After 2 years of consistent practice, Matthew had developed the ability to maintain spiritual consciousness while fully engaged in material activities. He wasn't withdrawing from the world, but operating within it from a completely different foundation of awareness. This is the ultimate goal of Goldsmith's mystical Christianity. Advanced recognition practice extends to relationships, perhaps the most challenging area for spiritual application. When someone treats you badly, personal reaction is automatic. Your human personality wants to defend, attack, or withdraw. These reactions keep you trapped in material consciousness of separation and conflict. Ashley practiced recognizing spiritual identity in difficult people. When her business partner repeatedly violated agreements and acted selfishly, her human reaction was anger and resentment. She wanted to fight back, protect herself, and punish his behavior. Instead, she practiced seeing beyond his human personality to his spiritual nature. This wasn't passive acceptance of bad behavior. She still addressed the business violations practically and legally, but she did so without personal animosity, without making him a villain. In her consciousness, she recognized his spiritual perfection while dealing appropriately with his human actions. The transformation took months. Gradually, her partner's behavior shifted. The hostile energy between them dissolved. He began acting more reasonably without Ashley demanding change. Eventually, they restructured their partnership on terms that served both parties. Her consciousness shift had removed the conflict foundation that manifested as business problems. Health challenges provide another advanced arena for recognition practice. When symptoms are severe, when pain is intense, when medical diagnoses are serious, maintaining spiritual consciousness requires extraordinary dedication. This is where Goldsmith's teachings reveal their ultimate power. Charles faced a heart condition, requiring major surgery. Doctors gave him statistics on survival rates and potential complications. Every medical conversation reinforced the reality and seriousness of his physical condition. He felt fear overwhelming his attempts at spiritual practice. He learned to practice recognition in very brief moments, not expecting to maintain spiritual consciousness continuously. During intense symptoms, he'd recognize divine wholeness for just a few seconds, then allow his human awareness to return. These micro-recognitions gradually extended, stabilizing his consciousness more in truth than in material appearances. The day before surgery, he experienced unusual peace. During the procedure, medical staff commented on his remarkable vital signs and stability. Recovery was significantly faster than predicted. Charles knew the medical intervention was necessary, but he also knew his consciousness practice had created the optimal conditions for healing beyond what medicine alone could provide. The advanced practice of carrying spiritual consciousness into challenging conversatio. NS transforms how you navigate conflict. When someone criticizes you, blames you, or attacks you verbally, the automatic human response is defensive. You want to justify yourself, prove them wrong, or counterattack with your own criticism. Melissa learned to practice recognition during difficult conversations with family members. When her adult children blamed her for past parenting mistakes, her instinct was to defend her choices or blame them for not understanding. Instead, she practiced recognizing their spiritual perfection beneath their human hurt. She didn't agree with their accusations or admit to failure she didn't believe she'd committed. But she recognized that their pain was real to them, that they were speaking from wounded consciousness, and that beneath their accusations was a desire for connection and healing. Her recognition practice gradually shifted the family dynamic. As she stopped defending and started recognizing spiritual truth, her children's accusations lost intensity. Over several months, conversations became less hostile, more honest, eventually more loving. The family healing emerged from consciousness shift, not from resolving who was right about the past. We've journeyed through Goldsmith's mystical Christianity, from basic recognition to advanced integration. The transformation this brings isn't about getting what you want from God. It's about discovering what you already are, as spiritual consciousness temporarily experiencing human form. Your pastor doesn't teach this because it empowers you completely. You don't need religious authorities when you recognize your own divine nature. You don't need elaborate rituals when consciousness itself is creative power. You don't need intermediaries when you are already one with the infinite. This isn't rebellion against Christianity, but fulfillment of its deepest mystical core. Jesus taught that the kingdom of God is within you, that you and the Father are one, that faith can move mountains. These weren't metaphors, but descriptions of consciousness, recognizing itself as divine. Goldsmith simply removed the layers of institutional interpretation that had buried these truths under religious structure. He gave you direct access to the consciousness that Jesus and all mystics throughout history had demonstrated. This is your spiritual inheritance, your true identity, your natural state of being. The life transformation from consistent recognition practice is gradual but comprehensive. You find yourself reacting differently to circumstances that once triggered fear, anger, or anxiety, not because you're controlling reactions, but because your consciousness has shifted to a foundation where those reactions no longer arise naturally. Problems that once seemed overwhelming lose their power over you, not because they disappear instantly, but because you recognize their temporary appearance in consciousness that remains fundamentally whole and complete, regardless of material circumstances. This shift is freedom itself. Relationships improve not because people change, but because your consciousness of them changes. You see past human personality into spiritual identity, which transforms how you interact without requiring the other person to be different. This is genuine, unconditional love rooted in recognition rather than emotional feeling. Health stabilizes not through medical intervention alone, but through consciousness that recognizes spiritual wholeness as the only reality. Financial abundance flows not because you manipulate circumstances, but because you've shifted from consciousness of lack to recognition of infinite divine supply as your true source. The question now is whether you'll practice these teachings or simply find them interesting intellectually. Goldsmith was clear. Consciousness transformation requires consistent practice, not just understanding. You can know these truths completely and remain unchanged if knowledge stays mental rather than becoming lived experience. Start with one practice today. Choose recognition, impersonalization, nothingnation, or spiritual listening. Commit to practicing it for 30 days, without measuring results, without checking whether it's working, without comparing your experience to others. Just practice. Expect resistance from your conditioned mind. Expect doubt, frustration, and temptation to quit. Expect material appearances to contradict what you're recognizing spiritually. All of this is normal. Consciousness transformation happens, gradually beneath surface awareness, manifesting externally only after internal shift reaches critical mass. Join the small percentage of people who actually practice, rather than just consume spiritual content. Goldsmith's teachings work, but only through application. Recognition transforms consciousness when practiced consistently, not when admired intellectually. Your spiritual authority waits for you to claim it through dedicated practice. Your life is about to change if you implement what you've learned here. Not because you finally found the right technique, but because you have discovered who you actually are beneath material appearances. You are consciousness itself, divine and infinite, temporarily experiencing human form, but never limited by it. This recognition is the secret your pastor doesn't teach, not because it's heretical, but because it transfers spiritual authority from institution to individual. You become your own priest, your own intermediary, your own connection to the divine because you recognize you are the divine expressed in human experience. Goldsmith spent his life making these mystical truths accessible to ordinary people. You don't need special gifts, years of theological training, or religious credentials. You need only willingness to practice recognition consistently until consciousness stabilizes in spiritual truth, regardless of material appearances. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith consciousness secrets, like this video to help others discover their true spiritual authority. Subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings that empower transformation, and comment, "I am consciousness," to confirm your new spiritual foundation.